The members of the panel this afternoon are Robert Clifford, who's beside me, Sarah Morales, and Douglas White. And without further ado, I'll ask Robert to begin with his remarks. Oh, yes, this is the one that's working, yes.
Etzquechel. My name is Robert Clifford. I'm Kusainich. I'm a member of the Sayout First Nation. I carry the name Yalquetza. That name was passed to me from my late grandfather, Earl Claxton Sr., and my grandmother is Joanne Claxton. My mom is Becky and my dad is Ray. I'm doing a PhD at Osgoode Hall Law School right now, York University, and previously had done my law degree and master's work here. So I think all of my supervisors, past and present, are here, and I'm going to be drawing a bit from various things I've written or talked about. So I was thinking I feel a little bit like I'm cheating on a test right now or something, reusing it all, but nonetheless, I think it's hopefully something useful for everyone else who's come. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you to everybody who organized this event. I know it takes a lot of work, and yeah, I'm very happy and honored to be here today. So my research interests are along the lines of revitalizing Indigenous legal traditions, specifically my own Kusainich legal tradition. So Indigenous societies have their own laws and legal traditions, which they've used to live in their homelands for thousands of years. And these laws reflect and generate out of the values, philosophies, lands, and worldviews of their people. So for my work, what I'm interested in is how do we understand Kusainich law as its own distinctive legal tradition? How can we think about and act on the regeneration of those laws and teachings? So to me, these types of questions are really what's at the heart of reconciliation when I think about it. And the resurgence of Indigenous laws, Kusainich laws. So I guess what I wanted to talk about today was just a little bit more about Kusainich law. I won't really go too far beyond that because that's where I come from. It's what I can speak to. I guess I also want to think about what role does spirituality play in Kusainich law, obviously. So I wanted to start with the words of one of my Kusainich teachers, Kevin Paul. He's a poet and a member of the Sartlip First Nation. And I was talking to him, and he said, "The old people are the song, and we are their echo." And I use this to think of it as a metaphor for how I understand Kusainich law and my own learning of Kusainich law and its resurgence today. Because an echo is always shaped by the original voice or song, even while it's reverberating back, shaped too by the context in which it resounds. So my vision of the future, which is obviously the panel that I was asked to speak on, the vision of the future that I have is very much shaped by those who came before me, by our Saanich Tsilangin. So Tsilangin is our ancestry or our birthright. So within Saanich Tsilangin includes our Sinchothan language, our Salkheili, which is our sacred teachings of life, and our Skhaels, which is beliefs or laws. And these form the basis of our traditional governance structures. So as I was taught, the word Skhaels translates as both beliefs and laws. I was told that the two aren't separate. So there's some ways in which this is more or less explicit, but I guess the point that I wanted to make was that Kusainich culture, attitudes towards land, and the Sinchothan language are at the heart of Kusainich law. And a lot of this is contained in our Kusainich creation stories, which in almost all instances are tied very specifically to specific places and to Sinchothan place names. Excuse me, I have a bit of a dry mouth here. So in Kusainich, we have creation stories for all of the islands, the lands, the waters, the animals, the plants, and all of the other beings in Kusainich territory, all of whom we view as our relatives. And it's through Kusainich law that we honor and maintain these relationships. So for instance, to make this point, I often use a story about a creation story of islands, which some of you may have heard me tell before, but I think it's a pretty useful story for an introduction about some of these ideas that I'm speaking about. So in Sinchothan, our word for island is Tchatches, and it translates as relatives of the deep. And this is because it ties to one of our creation stories, and that during the time of creation, our creator Hales was walking the earth, transforming people and animals into the objects there today. And at that time, there were no islands in Kucinich territory. The islands that are there today were our human beings. They were our ancestors. And during this time, Hales took some of the Kucinich ancestors and he threw them out into the ocean. And the way in which they landed, each of them landed in different ways. All of the different islands are based on the way they landed, the particular characteristics, or how Kucinich people use and relate to those islands. So I think often of a particular island. I can see it from the window of my house. It's right across from the Sail Reserve. It's called James Island today, but our name for it is Thaltas, and it means splashed on the face. I wrote a paper for John on this in my very first year of law school, actually. I guess as you can imagine, it's the way that that particular island landed in the ocean. The southeast wind comes through the channel and it's worn away at the southeast side of the island, making this big cliff, and there's spits there as well, just right down from my house. But during this time when these islands were created, after the creator threw out the islands, the Saanich people, and created the islands, he turned to the islands and said, "You will look after your relatives, the Saanich people," and obviously they're very important to our way of life. And at the same time, he turned to the Saanich people and he said, "You too will look after your relatives of the deep." And that reciprocal relationship is one of our laws, it's one of our teachings. Obviously those islands have sustained our way of life for thousands of years. So when I think about these stories and about imagining the future, it matters to me that we continue to draw strength from our creation stories, from our scales, our beliefs or laws, and that our ways of relating to others, both human and non-human, in Kucinich territory reflect and generate out of these laws and teachings. Now, of course, how we go about putting these into action in daily life always remains contextual. It was a bit hard for me, I was telling Sarah, it was hard for me to decide what I was going to speak about here today and what kind of example I was going to use to give this a bit more on the ground sort of feeling about something else that goes on in Kucinich territory. And I decided something I wrote my LLM thesis on was a fuel spill that happened at Goldstream River. So in 2011, there was a fuel truck driven by a drunk driver that crashed on the Malhat Highway, spilling 42,000 liters of gasoline and 600 liters of diesel into Goldstream River. And it flowed into the river and out into Saanich Inlet. So it's not just that damage to the ecosystem occurred and that there was death of many young fish. It's also that Goldstream, we call it Sakwatoth, has a central ceremonial bathing location for the Kucinich people. So our very starting point for how law, specifically Kucinich law, would tend to this harm is cast in a very different light from the very get-go. There are many different teachings and stories that connect to why this particular place is a bathing location, but the main aspect that I wanted to talk about today was focused on water. Specifically, another creation story I wanted to share about grandfather rain. And this can link back to several things that we heard on the last panel about creation stories being linked to place and difference between temporal and spatial thinking, and some of the kinship points that Gordon Christie made as well. So grandfather rain, the story is about Slamuch, the first Kucinich man who came to the earth in the form of rain. And just like Heidi mentioned, maybe we want to also wonder why it's the man who came to the earth first, but a story. I'll tell the story how I was told it, anyways. So, Slamuch, after he came to the earth in the form of rain, he helped carve the mountains, the rivers, the streams, and formed the lakes in Saanich territory. He brings life to the land and makes things grow. 5 minutes left, so yeah. And the Creator taught Slamuch how to bathe, how to cleanse himself in the lakes and the streams. And because he did this, he was given the gift of a family, and who he too taught to cleanse. And this is where Saanich people came from. So every time that we bathe, we honor Slamuch and Grandfather Rain. So I was thinking that it's in more than one sense that we owe everything to Grandfather Rain. Of course, he was given the gift of a family by the Creator. In that sense, we're all descendants of him. But also the fact that life is not possible without water. So there's a sacredness and a ceremonial aspect to water because of this for Saanich people and others as well. And this is something that's also reflected in the Sinchothan language more generally. So in many instances, we have two words for the same thing. We have a common word, so to speak, and a prayer word. And how we use those words reflects our laws and beliefs. So the word for water is kwa, but when we're bathing in cold water during ceremony, we use the name Slamuch to honor Grandfather Rain and to have the strength and the power to clean us. When we bathe, we ask Grandfather Rain to wash us, to wake us, and to strengthen us, to cleanse us. So in returning to the fuel spill at Goldstream, we can see how, given even just these couple different sets of stories, a different ontology, cosmology, and the way in which we characterize the harm that happened by that fuel spill at that place, at that river, that we're immediately faced with very different types of questions, very different types of issues to discuss, and I think a very different path for what different legal traditions might take as important in addressing the harm that was there. I obviously have lots of things to say about that spill, but I'm sure I'm down to 2 minutes here. So I guess I just wanted to think about, in terms of reconciliation and in reconciling two different legal traditions, that I see spirituality as a very important part of it, and that there's really just so much more to think about than, how do just two different laws or rules or lots of the things that we're used to thinking about law, this very black letter, narrow approach to law that I get asked about law all the time, and people think I can just sort of spit off answers left and right, and it's very kind of not a lot to it. It's just kind of predetermined almost without a lot of those cultural underpinnings. But I guess I would just encourage everyone, I'm sure everyone's driven by Goldstream many times. You can't go up the Malahat Highway without going over it. And obviously that's something in itself, given that bathing locations is somewhere where you usually do in private and with, in the early morning hours to yourself, and that's between you and Creator and so forth. So just the fact that there's a highway there too is something worth thinking about. But, just the ceremonial aspect of water and what it would mean, how that place and how Grandfather Rain was tainted by that fuel spill, and what that means even just to drive over that road on a daily basis. So I guess to wrap things up, I wanted to just bring in some words from my grandfather. As I mentioned, I carry his name. He's passed now, but I think of him a lot. And he was recalling the words that his father told to him one day. And he said that the river is a living thing, and if you listen, he will speak to you. So when I was thinking about my vision of the future, I guess my vision of the future is that we all start to listen. Obviously not just with our ears, but with our hearts and with all the important parts of us. And I hope that all of the work that we're doing here today, the work to revitalize Indigenous legal traditions and so forth, can be an important part of that. So thank you very much for listening. Haish Katsiyam.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the Lekwungen people. Oh, sorry. Good afternoon. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm also grateful for the Lekwungen people for hosting us today on their land, and also cognizant of the fact that we're meeting in this beautiful building, which represents a place of very important sacred and spiritual significance for my people. I'm Coast Salish. I'm a member of Cowichan tribes, and my traditional name, given to me by my grandfather and witnessed by our community, is Satahuia. And today my remarks really focus on looking forward, how do we go about achieving reconciliation, and more specifically acknowledging that courts have done little to move us towards that path, and thinking about other avenues such as spiritual connectedness that may push us towards that. So in many Indigenous cultures, the circle is an important tool or symbol. The circle influences how we as Aboriginal people view the world in the process of how life evolves, how the natural world grows and works together, how all things are connected, and how all things move toward their destiny. Aboriginal people see and respond to the world in circular fashion and are influenced by the examples of the circles in creation in our environment. Accordingly, it is often used to teach about the cyclical nature of activities or relationships and how they progress from one state to another throughout the year or over time more generally. For example, when a circle is divided into 4 quadrants representing spring, summer, fall, and winter, the 4 seasons may be used as a vehicle for discussion and deliberations. The seasons allow for cyclical change, birth, growth, maturity, and reflection. Much like the birth of new plants and animals in spring, the growth associated with summer, the maturity or harvest of the fall, and the reflection and celebrations during winter. This notion of different seasons providing opportunities for change, development, deliberation, and reflection resonates within my own community's cultural practices. As Coast Salish people, the winter season is a time of celebration and reflection where communities gather at our traditional longhouses and speeches are made which speak to the history of our relations with one another, and dances and ceremonies are performed which work to foster new relations and connections between kin, communities, and nations. These ceremonies are imperative to the Coast Salish culture because kinship is what holds us in relationship as individuals and bridges us as individuals into our communities and nations. Therefore, it is important to continually reaffirm these connections and their corresponding histories. I share these teachings with you because I believe they offer a unique way to conceptualize this process of reconciliation, an opportunity for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike to reflect on our past relationships and consider how best to renew these relationships. The relationship between Canada's Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples has been met with extreme hurdles over the past 150 years. While some have been overcome, arguably there is much work that needs to be done before reconciliation is achieved. However, one thing has become clear. Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike must look beyond the court in order to achieve meaningful reconciliation in Canada. This is premised on the fact that the doctrine of reconciliation, as it has been developed in the Supreme Court of Canada, has done little to foster mutual respect and tolerance of differing legal traditions, but rather has served as a tool to subvert Indigenous interests to colonial goals. Accordingly, if we are to work to achieve reconciliation, then aspects of Indigenous traditions which seek to foster mutual respect and tolerance and work to heal and create the foundations for harmonious relations must influence our thoughts, actions, and processes. My remarks today seek to address the question of what are some of the specific understandings of reconciliation that may be gained from Indigenous spiritual traditions, and how might they alter our approach to reconciliation. In doing so, I hope to also touch on the importance of respecting and honoring cultural difference in a process of reconciliation. As Rob just stated, Indigenous peoples have well-established legal traditions that contain principles and processes to aid in resolving disputes, regulating behaviors, managing resources, imposing obligations, and creating and renewing relationships. However, the court has failed to take these into serious consideration when attempting to achieve reconciliation through its Section 35 jurisprudence, oftentimes viewing them as spiritual practice with no legal effect. In doing so, the court has not only done an injustice to Indigenous peoples, but has also hampered the process of reconciliation in Canada. This is because oftentimes these traditions contain many important principles and practices which could be of use to restoring and reconciling the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. The example I would like to use to illustrate the importance of spirituality to the process of reconciliation comes from my own Coast Salish community. My late elder, Wes Modeste, shared a beautiful story with me about the last time he witnessed a traditional sacred process used to restore balance between communities after an interpersonal dispute had occurred. He shared, so quote, "In the late 70s or 80s, there was an Indian dance in Nanaimo, and a couple of Cowichan boys went outside of the longhouse to have a smoke or something. On their way back in, some of the members of the Nanaimo community beat them up. I'm not sure exactly how things evolved after they were beat up. I guess maybe they went inside with bloodied faces, or maybe they just left the longhouse. Not long after, the families from Nanaimo came down to Cowichan for another Indian dance, the whole family. And they hired a speaker, and they called witnesses, many, many witnesses. And they called forward that young fellow that got beat up. They publicly called him forward, and they publicly apologized to that young fellow for the conduct of their children for beating him up like they did in Nanaimo. That is a public form of apology. And the family put a blanket in his hand and money. The parents of the boys who beat him up put money in his hand, and the rest of the family followed. And it is a very large family. He had a lot of money in his hand. But how things unfolded after that, after all the money was given, the speaker got up and concluded the work. But after the speaker said that, witness after witness came up to respond. They said, 'We will do the honorable thing and to restore your honor.' And they scolded the young people who had beat up the boys from Cowichan. And they said, 'See your family here? They are all here because of your wrongdoing. And you see all your family members following with money? You are now responsible to repay them. So anytime anyone in your family has work, you bring money to help.' And with a large family like that, I suspect it took them quite a while to repay." End quote. So although there are many ways to interpret this story, for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to focus my comments on three aspects: speakers, witnesses, and blanketing. I believe that these three practices and the legal principles contained within can aid in the process of reconciliation between Canada and its Indigenous populations. So although not expanded upon in much detail by Elder Modeste, it is significant that a speaker was hired to conduct the business of the family making amends. Hiring speakers is a widely practiced tradition within the big houses of the Coast Salish people. Shirley Julian, a Stolo elder, explains, At feasts, there would be special people who were speakers, real good speakers, one from each place. They knew the background and the history and the culture. These speakers are trained from a young age in the Hul'qumi'num language and in the history of the communities. As a result, they possess qualities that lend them authority and cause others to call on them for help or to represent their family during ceremonies, disputes, gatherings, and other such. Their judgment relating to the words they choose to use is trusted when they're facilitating disputes, namings, memorials, and so forth. In fact, different speakers are utilized for their varying techniques. Although different situations require different speakers, one unifying characteristic of speakers is that they are all trusted to speak on behalf of the families they represent. In doing so, they often begin their remarks by recounting the family history and contextualizing it in relation to the work at hand, whether it be a naming ceremony, a memorial, or a dispute resolution process. This process enables all parties involved to share their understanding of the history, rights, and/or dispute at issue. In effect, it allows for the recognition of counter-narratives through the use of hired speakers. This recognition helps to develop an environment of trust and mutual respect, as all parties involved have an opportunity to both hear and reflect upon the parties' positions. This recognition of counter-narratives, done in an equal and respectful manner, is an important principle to consider in the context of reconciliation. History has demonstrated the dangers of trying to achieve reconciliation when only one narrative is recognized. Arguably, if reconciliation is to be achieved, then the legal histories and legal traditions of Indigenous peoples themselves need to be heard, acknowledged, and recognized, both inside of the courtroom and outside of it. The process of witnessing was also beautifully illustrated in the story above. As Elder Modeste shared, speakers will call witnesses within the Coast Salish legal tradition. This practice of calling witnesses serves as both a legal ratification process and to maintain the legal record. It has been described as follows, quote, "Being called to witness in the Coast Salish tradition is a sacred honor. Bearing witness by a hired speaker carries responsibilities and duty. As a witness, they are to listen and watch the work that is going to take place. They are to carry the message back to their home community. If in the future or any time in their life there is a concern over what took place, they as witnesses have to recall what was heard and seen with regard to the event." Calling witnesses places responsibilities on all participants in the process, families, speakers, and community members, and ensures that reconciliation and the maintenance of good relations is a shared responsibility. This is also an important principle to remember in thinking about reconciliation between Canada and its Indigenous peoples. Arguably, in the past, individuals have placed too much responsibility in the hands of government or the courts, expecting that these parties will resolve this relationship. However, this has not been the result. If true reconciliation is to occur, then every Canadian must have a role to play and a vested interest in the outcome. Just as witnesses serve to keep the individuals or families, and even speakers, accountable to their actions and decisions, Canadians also have a role to play in ensuring accountability in the greater reconciliation process. It is also significant in the story above that the victim was gifted a blanket. Blankets have value, spiritual and financial, within the Coast Salish culture. As such, when gifted, they represent the respect that an individual or family is bestowing upon the recipient. In describing the symbolism of a blanketing ceremony in a dispute resolution process, late Penelakut Elder Willie Seymour shared with me, quote, "If one community was offended, they never allowed that to go by. Somebody would step in, even somebody that is in the background would step in, and they would blanket the ones that are victims. They will have a ceremony, mass dance, or sometimes they will just stand them up and honor them with gifts. Blanketing them. You shield them from hurt. You shield them from the harm, and at the same time, you are embracing them back their strength. You are picking up their soul and putting it back into their being, so it serves more than one purpose," end quote. In history occupied with policies of deceit, fraud, racism, and alienation, which has created an environment of mistrust, caution, sorrow, and contempt, one cannot negate the importance of preventing further harm within the reconciliation process. Arguably, the only way to pick up Indigenous souls and put them back into their being is to enable them an opportunity to live according to their own laws and traditions and articulate reconciliation in accordance with their own understandings. This is the only way to give them back their strength. Accordingly, any process of reconciliation, whether engaged in by the courts or by Canadian people themselves, must do more than merely add rhetoric or performance to the process of reconciliation. It must make a real attempt to restore honor to the Indigenous peoples of Canada by embracing them and making space for their histories, experiences, and traditions, and shielding these from further damage. Hajkasian.
Asiam nisiaya, Intapek Walasalton Tanis Nanemoch, Ait Nashqualo and Qonis Heitsepka, Siam Mastimoch, Heitsepka, Sanish Mastimoch. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Doug White. My co-Salish name's Kwalasalton. My new channel name's Cleishan. At the very beginning, I want everyone just to stand up and stretch for a second. I know it's hot and that you've just sat through for half an hour. Stretch a bit, twist, bend your back. Oh, I feel like I need to. This is hard work, exhausting work. And I'm honored to be asked to come and talk and share a few words in this important conference. I know in my own work at home, all of my adult life I've been working in the space of trying to resolve the problems between Indigenous peoples and the rest of the country. And this has played out in so many different ways. I think we're really in a unique and a defining moment in this country's history that we have fought for generations, for over 100 years of advocacy. Indigenous peoples have been standing up and saying our Aboriginal title matters, that our right to self-determination matters, and we have to reestablish that basic reality if we're going to get to dignity. And so one of the important streams of that reconciliation work, and one of the key ones that has really converged, is in the legal process. It started many, many years ago. There's been all kinds of decisions. In my own experience, where I'm from in Snuneymuxw, I became the chief. I was there as chief in 2009, 2010. And one of the first things that really became crystal clear to me was the incredible depth and power of denial of the Crown in terms of the importance of recognizing or denying our treaty rights. And for me, it was a very important thing to having gone through law school and learned all about the rule of law, and you read beautiful decisions like the Quebec secession reference where the court's talking about what are the most cherished values about Canada. What is Canada? It's one of the only times the court has ever been asked and has ever answered the question, who is Canada? What is Canada all about? A really beautiful, powerful decision. One of the elements being the rule of law, of course. Sounds trite, but important. But when you sit there as the chief of the nation and you realize that we have a treaty from 1854 that was meant to be a reconciliation of sovereignties, the pre-existing sovereignty of the Snuneymuxw people and the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. 1850, 100 and whatever years ago, 60 years ago. And then in the summer of 63, a couple of people go hunting deer and are charged for hunting deer out of season on the Provincial Game Act, and they get dragged into court. And they stood up, Clifford White and David Bobb stood up in that courtroom in front of the magistrate, and they said, our answer to the charge is that they call it a treaty of peace. There is a treaty of peace between our people and the Crown that allows us to hunt in accordance with our own laws. And this was one of the most absurd things, apparently, that the magistrate had ever heard in his life. Everyone knows that there was never treaties made in British Columbia. And he expressed a lot of frustration with that different storyline of law and history. And, of course, he convicted them, and we went all the way through the appeal up to the Supreme Court of Canada. We got our Supreme Court of Canada decision that, believe it or not, the basic essence of it was to answer the question, is there a treaty or not with the Snuneymuxw people? Because the Crown's position is that there's no such thing. Amazing to have to stand up and argue about things like that, but that's what was done, and the case was won in 1965. And we get, go over the years, and we get to 1982, and this is now one of the major moments in Canadian history where Canadians are standing up and answering the question, who are we? Who are we as a country? And everybody knows this story. I only have a brief few moments here, so I don't want to get into it. But basically, an important part of that storyline of the repatriation was that the original Prime Minister Trudeau did not believe ultimately that Aboriginal peoples have space inside the Constitution, and he didn't want that to be in the Constitution. And then Berger, who we had brought in to appeal on White and Bob, then stood up. Aboriginal people stood up across the country, and they said, we need to be recognized in this Constitution, and they fought, and ultimately it was kind of, shove it back in there, and sure, we'll say this in Section 35. Importantly, there's anecdotal stories about the BC Attorney General of the day informing the BC Premier of the day that yes, don't worry, you can agree with the Section 35 language now because we have the word existing put in. And our legal theory in BC is that there are no existing Aboriginal or treaty rights. They've all been extinguished. So don't worry. We'll say it in the Constitution, but it doesn't mean anything. So, we get 1982, and then, I show up as the chief in 2009. My grandfather, so 2 generations passed since the White and Bob litigation. I show up as the chief, and the Crown is in a position of being able to deny that the treaty ever happened in 1854, that the Snuneymuxw people have a Supreme Court of Canada decision from 1965, or that Section 35 of the Constitution says what it says, that it recognizes and affirms those rights. And you sit there and you go, holy moly, what are we going to do? What do we do with this? What is this country all about? How is it possible that it's true that they deny in such an in-depth way? And so, I'm going to talk about fighting a bit, and I feel a little bit embarrassed now because of Sarah's story that my people were beating up your people in the 70s and 80s, and I apologize about that. But an important part of what I wanted to talk about was, for me, this constant, I feel this pendulum swinging between fighting to protect my people, protect my children and future generations, and then wanting those kids to be loved by all of you. And so in my work as a chief, I realized that, I started to really, intensively work to try to advance reconciliation, respect, all of those things. And there's all different kinds of pathways that you can go about that. The law is obviously important, but insufficient by itself. We need far more than just the legal process. The political process you would be hard-pressed to ever find a more expansive and clear statement than Section 35. Obviously, not enough by itself. And so, since the Haida decision in 2004, there's been a tremendous change in the economic landscape of the country, and still not enough. And I really started to understand the work. You stand up and fight. I got to a reconciliation agreement with British Columbia in the spring of 2013. How did I get to that reconciliation agreement? By everything that Jeremy Weber and John Burroughs and John McLaren taught me about fighting. They're like fighting instructors, how to wield the legal system and go and throw hard punches. The legal process is hyper-adversarial. It pits people against each other. But so I used some of that knowledge and that strength to go and fight against the Crown, to go and make clear that they do not have scope or jurisdiction to interfere with the continuity of my people's treaty rights, to paralyze provincial decision-making in Snuneymuxw territory. And that led them then finally, when you're in a position where you have to turn things into a bloodbath to get any attention. You have to negotiate with your foot on the neck of the Crown and proponents, industry, Canadians, because a lot of the decisions were simple decisions. Someone has a dock that needs a permit renewed, a dock that was built 30 years ago, and we say, no, that dock is not going to be renewed. Because we're dealing with, this is now the 160-something year of denying the continuity of our fisheries rights, and this little dock is a part of that. And so you fight and you get to some conclusion. You get to a place where you get progress is made. On the day of the reconciliation agreement signing, the local newspaper published the most racist, ugly letter to the editor that said that Aboriginal peoples are worth nothing. They have never contributed anything to humanity. It was it was a really ugly letter that was published purposefully on that day of reconciliation in Snuneymuxw. It was like, when you read it, it was like being punched in the stomach. And that episode and that incident made me really think about what is the real nature of the work. What are the different pathways at play that we have to address? And I went from, so there's the legal, there's the political, there's the economic, and I said there's a real need for social change. And how do we get to that social change? What is it that's necessary? What are the components of it? How do we inspire Canadians to become something different? Because I do think that is the defining moment that we're in when we have the Chilcotin decision, the claim to support the UN declaration, the outcome of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which, by the way, did not get me in the mood for reconciliation when I found out my mom and her family were used as lab rats at Alberni Residential School. Medical experimentation was going on when she was there of depriving children of nutrition to see what the effects of that would be. So that did not get me in the mood for reconciliation in any way at all. But when we have all of these different streams and pressures pushing in social change, where does that lead us to? When the former Chief Justice of Canada stood up with Justice, or now Senator Sinclair, when Beverly McLaughlin stood up and they talked about the residential school experience amounting to cultural genocide, that it was an act of what they called cultural genocide. So she named that episode and she said where we have the gist of what she talked about in her response was around tolerance. And I thought that was very interesting. It was I thought it was a very powerful and important speech that she gave. But I thought it was a very narrowly legalistic kind of framework that she was speaking from. Of course we need tolerance, right? We have to stop harming each other. We have to stop the pain and the suffering. But I asked myself, where does that get us? You know, you go from fighting mode to, okay, tolerance, everyone go back to your own corner and stop hurting each other. Tolerance, I learned from William Hatcher, is acceptance without care. And he says and talks about the next stage or the next step, and this is where I think the spiritual dimension starts to come in a bit. Because he said, altruistic love, on the other hand, is acceptance, both acceptance, but also caring and concern. And so when I started talking in my speeches about this work of reconciliation, I started telling people, I want you to know that I love you, that I really love you. I'm concerned about your well-being. I'm concerned about the way that I want my children's lives to unfold and all of our future generations, that I want them to be loved and cherished by all of you and by your children and your grandchildren. I want them to grow up knowing that their well-being is of a concern to other Canadians. And so it's a transition from, fighting in the courts to politics to economics, and then moving into what are the necessary components of social change, which I think was a very specific part of the TRC mandate and the way that they did their work was very much about engaging Canadians and having national, reach out and have major national events where Canadians are brought into the discussion. Very important and powerful. But I think though at the end of the day, it's still not sufficient, and this is why this event today of talking about spirituality and reconciliation I think is so critically important, because I think it is the final piece of the puzzle of the different streams that have to be brought to bear. I can't even begin to tell you how depressed I've been this month because of what's happened in our country and the criminal justice system. Holy man, that's upsetting, painful. If there was anything remotely like altruistic love, real acceptance, real concern and caring, there would not be the unbelievable crises in our country of overrepresentation of our children in care and of our people in jails. There wouldn't be the homelessness that we see in the streets of this country. That if we can somehow, I agree with this notion of, let's not figure out how we're inconsistent with each other, but let's talk to each other and figure out if this is truly the defining moment that I say it is, that for all of these reasons of these streams of reconciliation converging, that we have to ask ourselves the most fundamental and basic questions about who we are. You think about John Ralston Saul effectively saying in recent books, Canada has misunderstood who it is. It's not been honest about itself about who it is. And that we have to go through work together of answering and inquiring into who are we? Who are we as Indigenous peoples? Who are we as Canadians? Who do we want to become in the future? And if we're going to get to a reconciliation that's premised on really, truly authentic relationships, then spirituality is an inescapable component of that discussion and that understanding. If we're going to get to the most fulsome relationship, it's going to be premised on the idea that if we're going to be in love with someone else, we set aside our own interests, and their interests and well-being become primary. When you're in a loving relationship, that's how it plays out. You care about more each other than you care about yourself. And I think to really get there, we've got a long way to go. Holy man, I was on the CBC radio and this Bushi stuff. There was some guy on the line from something called Farmers with Firearms. There's an actual social theory at play in this country that it is okay to kill Indigenous people to protect property. And I was on the CBC Vancouver, and there was a guy that called in, and he said, "Oh, I'm telling you right now, I would do the same thing." And that really, holy man, that really, it's really knocks you back to hear that that's in the hearts and the minds of Canadians in this country. And I do not, I think it's our hard work now to really be serious about this work. The TRC process harmed our people. They knew that it would, but they did it in good faith to try and raise the whole country up. Because the country can't inflict that kind of harm on Indigenous peoples without profoundly harming itself. It's a pain and a harm that, while primarily borne by Indigenous peoples, is also held by all Canadians. You see studies of truth and reconciliation commissions in West Africa, psychologists going to see what was the outcome of that work, psychologically speaking. They found out that there is more post-traumatic stress disorder, more anxiety, more depression on the side of the victims in that country's history. We have seen that exact thing here in this country. Some of the litigants in the Plint litigation are no longer with us because of bringing that pain to the fore, to talk about it, to have it addressed, was too much for them to bear. So all of Canada owes a great duty to that incredibly dignified act of standing up and talking about that pain and suffering of all of those survivors. We cannot allow this to become a window dressing moment. We have to show respect to them, and we have to honor them by doing the work that we're talking about here today in the most real and meaningful ways. So, reconciliation will play out in multiple different pathways, including the spiritual path. It'll be a necessary one if we're going to reorient our relations premised on that real recognition of each other as real human beings with souls and with spirits that we matter to each other. I think that the social change paradigm is not enough. It has to be rooted in that higher reaching mode of spirituality. And so I want to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to share those few thoughts. I've learned a lot from so many different people here last night and today. And I want to extend my great respect and gratitude to you all. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. We now have about 40 minutes for your interventions, questions, and comments, so please approach the microphones. I think we're down to one microphone, so we'll just pass this one around. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, I hope that's working.
Okay. Hello, my name is Penny Joy. Thank you for the huge richness of all that's gone on today. I'm quite full on. This last panel particularly touches me in as much as one of my deep interests and involvement is in restorative justice. And it's not been mentioned specifically in terms of reconciliation. I see it as being a very important small seed of positive possibility. And in your story, Sarah, I understand the roots of where it came from. I mean, I knew it came from the Indigenous peoples, the whole concept. But hearing your story, it lightened my heart because it spoke to me. I understood what was happening. I understand what you're saying about the anguish of what's happening right now, which is absolutely true. But I want to try and put in a little bit of light into the discussion that's going on. About 7 years ago, myself and my husband and a few friends were instrumental in beginning a restorative justice Victoria in a very, very small way. We began approaching the police and approaching the courts, and it took a long time, but gradually, after initially being very apprehensive of dealing with these strange woo-woo people, they did come around. The organization now is handling a lot of files coming from both the court and the police, and probably most of you know about restorative justice, which is an alternative justice system. Some people refer to it as transformative justice now, which is not focused on punishment, but on resolution of whatever incident is being dealt with. And clearly, it can only deal with a certain amount of uproar in the community, but it can do it very successfully, particularly with young people, with first offenders, who might be helped to stop the downward path that they've started on. And I'm also part of the Restorative Justice Coalition in William Head Institution. So we weekly meet with inmates there, and you must be aware that there is a disproportionate number of First Nations people in the prisons. These evenings, for me, are an incredible gift of knowledge and learning about how these men have come to the place that they've come to, and almost invariably, because these evenings They come to these evenings. It's not a prison program. It's volunteer. So the people that come are those that are genuinely interested in reflection, in resolving, in doing something positive about their crime path. And in speaking of it, they reveal how often they come from backgrounds where they were never listened to from yay high onwards. And so the whole idea of starting the Victoria Restorative Justice Group was to provide an opportunity, but particularly for young people, to be listened to and to be acknowledged and to be brought together with support to resolve in as best way possible the incident that has been referred to. So I just wanted to put that in there, and I'd love any comments that you care to contribute to this.
Thank you so much for that. I'm the co-chair on the criminal justice side of the BC Aboriginal Justice Council, who has a dual mandate of dealing with the overrepresentation of our people in jails and of our children in care. So I very much appreciate the work that you do and the focus that you have on that different mode of dealing with those criminal justice matters in a way that's different than just simply throwing someone in jail and letting them rot in solitary confinement for the foreseeable future. We know at the Justice Council that our work, the council could have been called the Poverty and Addictions Council, or the something in the Mental Health Council. There's all of these driving factors that are at play, but at the sort of the deep root of it is the experience of colonialism that led to real poverty, that led to real despair, the sense of hopelessness of living under the Indian Act system, the disempowerment that it manifests in so many different ways. And so, I have a story I tell about the first real Indian I ever met. It wasn't until I was in my 20s. And we were having a discussion inside of our community about 20 years ago to articulate our own membership law. It was a beautiful discussion with the elders and with the community over a couple of days about what it means, who are the Snuneymuxw people? Where do we come from? Who are we? What does it mean when someone marries in? What if they bring children with them? What happens when marriage breaks down? On and on and on, all the nuances of what it means to be a part of a nation or not. And on the second afternoon, someone stood up, because what the impulse that was driving our discussion was the reality that the Indian Act excludes a lot of our family from being a part of our community. So we were trying to create a more expansive law that would bring back into our people, our family that was being excluded by the narrowness of the Indian Act. But so on the second afternoon, someone stood up and they said, "I don't know who the hell you guys think you're talking about. Those people aren't Indians. They don't belong on this Indian reserve. They have no right to be here with us." Yada, yada, yada. Yammered away. And while he was talking, I just got the most sick, ugly feeling in my stomach. The realization of how this poor person who I love, his entire sense of who he is as a Snuneymuxw person, all of his Snawayath, all of the teachings of our people, has been pushed out and supplanted. And what he cherishes and what he holds most dear and most tightly and closely, what he's willing to stand up and fight for, comes from the Indian Act. 100 and something years of living under the Indian Act, and oh my God, there you go, there's an Indian. He's not, what he's fighting for, the place that he's coming from, is not about Snuneymuxw, it's about Indianness. And so, and I read a paper, an anthropologist wrote about the Snuneymuxw in the 60s. Memorandum to a Coast Salish people, and she said, "I want you to know that what I see in you is this sociological concept called anome, that you're lost, you're disoriented, your whole system of values has been disarticulated. You don't know who you are anymore. Your compass doesn't point north anymore. And I was really quite offended when I read that. But as I grew up and got older, I saw what she saw in my people, including with that man. And so restorative justice, I think, is a very important paradigm of helping and assisting people that for whatever reasons have ended up in the criminal justice system. A big part of the reason why Gladue is so important is that it's intended in some way to reintegrate that person with who they are properly and reintegrating them with their broader family and their community. Really hard work, serious work that, getting back to what I was talking about earlier. Who are you? What's happened to you? What are you struggling with? What are your challenges? Most importantly, how can we help you? And how can we structure an approach of assistance and healing so that you can overcome these challenges and get back onto a dignified and proper path? And so the restorative justice approach is one that's much aligned with that kind of initiative of repairing the damage that's been done by the colonial experience that manifests through the criminal justice system and the overrepresentation of our peoples in jails. The system itself pulverizes our people. It's full through and through of systemic racism. And every opportunity we can to get our people out of that system and into a restorative program, some alternative program, it's like throwing a lifeline to those people. It's showing them love and concern for who they are and their well-being, as opposed to locking them up and throwing away the key to punish them. So very different mode, a very important one. So I acknowledge and respect the work that you do.
My name is Saul Arbus, and this is kind of a tag team because it's my wife who just spoke. But I also think I have something optimistic to say. And it comes from the talk earlier today by Heidi Stark. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, though I didn't try her Aboriginal name. That the earth of the creation is the ultimate authority within the sense of Indian legal concepts. And that we all are in a relationship with the Creator and with each other. So that the assertion of authority, as I understand it, in terms of land rights and the competing claims and so forth, is really, I come to understand, is actually at a higher level than that, in the sense that the authority is not actually tribal or First Nation or really challenging Canada, but the appeal is to a higher authority and according to the right relationship with all life. It's at a different level. So it's in fact ultimately not adversarial, which you mentioned about the adversarial nature of these claims. And I think there's something in that that can be appealing to people, all people. And finally, this learning is key to understanding the attraction and the profound attraction between environmentalists and First Nations. This is not superficial. This is not simply instrumental. This is not simply gaining advantage because First Nations are being heard, finally, in some courts and other places. But rather, it's authentic in the sense that it is reflecting the hunger for spiritual connection that is represented by the First Nations and recognizing the land as the ultimate authority to which we defer. So that this changes, this is I think, is the profound connection that actually exists. It's ultimately a spiritual connection to the land and through the land to each other. And I think there's great promise in that. So thank you for all of these presentations today. It's been a phenomenal day of learning. I've gone much deeper as a cultural anthropologist, has worked with First Nations for 30 years or more. I've learned more today than probably in many of those preceding years. So thanks again.
I'll just reflect really quickly on the comment, and this sort of builds on what Robert was talking about earlier. I've often thought about the difficulty of having a meaningful conversation about what from the Canadian perspective is seen as natural resource issues and what for us on our side can be something very different. And when you think about, how do you treat things that you love and recognize as having real inherent value and personality, and that they're alive, and that even they're your relations? And one of the examples I often talk about to explain the incredible difference between worldviews that can sometimes play out is with respect to fish. At Snuneymuxw, we have a first salmon ceremony for the dog salmon when they come back. And so I explain to people why we do that. What is that all about? That it's about the fact that those fish are our relations, because in the time before the current time period, one of the daughters of one of our chiefs married into those people. When we were not always in this mode where people and animals were so different. There was a time period when we were much more closely connected. And so it's the fact of the first salmon ceremony is about showing the respect and the recognition to the fact that those fish are part of our family. And it would be one of the most disrespectful things in the world to just sit on the beach and let them go by without acknowledging and recognizing them and showing them love and concern. And so, when you have that kind of a relationship with fish, and then you're trying to sit down and talk to the other side of the table, and it's some politicians that are and technicians that see it as a science, and they're there to protect the interests of commercial fishermen that just see it as a commodity to be caught and sold and yada. I mean, it's like, holy man, it's a challenging thing to really, you really have to put some effort and time into really understanding who each other is and your perspectives on these complex things before you can really start to resolve conflict. Just wanted to share that. Although this thing's turned off. Did anybody hear anything I said? Yes. Oh, good. Okay, good.
Is this one working? Yeah. This one. Powerful panel. Asa, Wakinakin, Salasan, Bath, Husseinich, Yishin Nemuch, Aisha Kal, Sam, Robert, Sarah, and Doug, Hosnian, Australia, Paul, Nisqualo, and Titsawato. Osiam. My name is Bear Sam. I'm from Husseinich, Sarla. And listening to Robert speak brought me home. I live here in Esquimalt now, but listening to him tell the history of our people kind of made me homesick. It's not that far. For some reason, I know Robert. I went to school with his sister Rochelle here in New Vic. And she talked about Robert one day when I was sitting in her office, and we were talking about Robert. I said, I didn't know you had a brother. Oh yeah, he's going to be a big shot lawyer. And I ran into, Doug, I don't know if he remembers, up at Harvard's Mountain. And we were talking about how my mother, Julia Fraser, was from Nanaimo. Oh, we're cousins. And I'm pretty sure somewhere down the line, I'm probably Sarah's cousin too. I hear that modest and all this, and I really want to raise my hands to the three of you and save the best for last. There were some powerful words today, and especially from our friends here. I just want to say hi to you, see all my relations.
Chinese name is Gozikin. Chinese on my mother's side and British on my father's side. Born in Hong Kong, when it was a British colony. Thank you so much to each of you for what you shared today and for everyone else. There's been a lot shared in the last couple of days. I was able to listen in on Sarah Hunt yesterday and John and Bob last night and tonight. And my question reflects things I've been thinking about after listening to them, and also things I've been thinking about for a long time. As a first-generation immigrant Canadian, not born here, and so not born a citizen, I've reflected a lot about what it means to be a citizen in this country, and I've thought a lot about this country that I now find myself in and call home. And in learning about the origin story of this country, I've always thought a lot about treaties. And I also want to say that it's really special to me to say these words to you, Robert, because your Uncle Earl has taught me so much about what it means to live on these lands. So it's really special that I can say these to you. And this is a very emotional topic for me, so please apologize any stammering, or I apologize for any stammering. The new government has required a change in the oath to the citizenship oath, so that new citizens have to pledge allegiance, but pledge to the original treaties of this country. And my question is, how do you see the process of revisiting treaties and creating new treaties as an important opportunity, since they are what tie all of us together here on these lands, but also to our relationship to the land? And I think especially last night, John said something that I've been thinking about a lot, in that the healing of people will not happen without the healing of the land. And Gordon Christie spoke to those ideas in his presentation earlier about the ecological realities that we face. I do my studies here on campus in environmental studies, and I've come more and more to think of environmentalism as reconciliation, as the healing of our relationships to land and each other. I was also reminded of this yesterday, being International Women's Day. Melina Labucan Massimo wrote a really amazing piece in the David Suzuki Foundation website, connecting violence against the land with violence against Indigenous peoples and bodies, and specifically Indigenous women. And so I can't help but see our relationship to land and relationship to each other fundamentally being approached going into the future as well through treaty. And I apologize if this was talked about in Heidi's talk this morning. I wasn't here, but I really appreciate your perspectives and everyone else's perspectives on what it means to be treaty people, and what it means for us to go forward with trying to make these relationships sacred ones. Thank you.
Do you want to go up? Should I just go down the line?
So, yeah, thank you very much. And is this on? Yeah. I'll send my regards to my uncle as well, so, and my sister. So thank you very much. Yeah. I guess so we're signatories to the Douglas Treaty as well, so we aren't in any process of entering a new treaty, obviously, but I think that we talk about that treaty a lot back at home, and I guess when I think about the treaty now, I often think about some of the work that my cousin Nick Claxton is doing, with the reef net fishery. And in the treaty it says, that we have the right to fish as formally, and he's very adamant that when it says that, it means we don't just have the right to fish, we have the right to our fisheries laws, to all of our governance structures that went around our fishery. So I guess it was a couple years back. I was just moving to Toronto, so I missed it. Hopefully I can convince him to go again. But he connected with our relatives over from Lummi because they had done this a number of years before. And he got a bunch of people together to make a reef net from scratch, to go through the proper ceremonies of bringing the reef net back, and to going out to our reef netting site in Pender Island and to start bringing back our traditional fisheries, our traditional laws, and to being on the land with that treaty, with those stories, and all of that involved. So this might not be exactly what your question's getting to, because this is very much kind of it's definitely working better now, or something, I don't know. Sort of more of community-driven sort of resurgence, I guess. But it didn't just involve community members. He reached out. I think it was a really windy day, so they had planned to paddle over in their canoes, but they weren't able to make it all the way. So I think it was the RCMP who helped them with their boats to drag them over and to have other people involved as well. So it's often when I just think of these things that are huge to us, but you might just, it's one day, you might think of all the little things that are important, all the little things that we can do to respect treaties, to respect the land, and to all of the relationships. For us, our creation story, I won't go through the whole story, but our sacred mountain, Teolnuch, we tied our canoes to our Buddhist tree in our flood story. So often just when I'm walking out with my son, I'll stop and I'll say thank you to that arbutus tree, and I'll take a moment to reflect upon what that story means to me and what it means for me to be here today. So I guess my point is, in looking at the treaty, it's not always just the big things, but sometimes it's those little things that are really important as well, just in day-to-day life. So I hope that helps a bit.
I think this, is this one working now? Okay. So my community is not a signatory to a Douglas Treaty, so we're currently in a negotiation process with the province of BC and Canada, and we have been since 1993, and I think there's hope that we're close to an agreement in principle, but I'm not holding my breath on that, and I think that process is one that needs to be seriously critiqued in this age and time when we're talking about reconciliation and what that means. My community currently has a complaint before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, arguing that the treaty process itself is violating our right to property, our right to culture, because of the starting point that government comes to the table where they don't respect our connection to our entire territory. We're not unique on the island, but unique in BC in that 85% of our territory is now in the hands of fee simple property owners. So it's automatically off the table for negotiation, and the 15% of Crown land that's on, it's not all on the table either for negotiation for various reasons, whether it has important aquifers or other important sites for municipal use. And I've worked at the Hulkaminum Treaty Group, our treaty negotiating table, and I've sat there in the mornings, and our elders, as is custom with the practice I just shared, they stand up and they talk about the connection to that territory, and they talk about our history there, and it drives the negotiators nuts. Like, it's wasting time. They flew from Vancouver, Canada. They do not want to hear that. Like, yes, that's in the past. The treaty is about a forward-looking relationship. But I think if we think about this story, the story that I shared from West Odessa, we think about the fact that we want to reconcile, we want to make Indigenous peoples whole again, we want to pick up the souls of my people who through policies of colonization and, their lands have been stolen. The potlatch, our spirit dancing was outlawed. Our children have been taken. Our children still are taken. Our communities are, in crises. If we think that we are to pick up their souls and put them back in the body, then you have to look backwards. You have to acknowledge the harm that has been done and promise to do no more harm. So in my mind, we're far way off, because as we sit at the table, land is being taken off the table for negotiation. Our policies are putting in place that shrink this document, or what the promise this document has for our people. So, I think reconciliation can't just be rhetoric from the government anymore. It has to influence all policies and decision makers, and ministers and deputy ministers should be given directives to their community that says, when we're, like in all aspects of our contact with Indigenous peoples, we have reconciliation in mind, and not just reconciliation being certainty for government, but reconciliation as it is defined by that community, what is needed by that community to feel like their souls have been taken up off the ground and restored to their bodies.
Does this one work? Thanks very much for your question and reflection on. I think it does get to the core of the kind of moment that we're in, that there's some sense that there is a new approach, a really fundamentally different approach afoot. And how is that going to play out? What will that look like? Treaties has been an old mechanism, like it's a kind of a tool to get to a different kind of relationship, to express relations to each other. We have treaties amongst each other over generations and long period of time, all kinds of stories about our coordination of the Coast Salish peoples to achieve all different kinds of objectives and ends. And there was a very short period of treaty making at the outset of the colony here on Vancouver Island that only lasted for 4 years, from 1850 to 54. And then there hasn't been real treaty making, since the Nisga'a was prompted. But, I was talking about how the legal propelled the political. So when the legal process pushed and Frank Calder and Tom Berger and the Nisga'a people brought the Calder case to trial, then the judges said, yeah, there's something to this. You guys better go and sit down and sort this out. So they started that work. Long, complex negotiation that finally ended up with the Nisga'a Treaty, and at the same time the BC Treaty process was started up. With the idea being, that basic one that I opened with in my comments was that on the Indigenous side, what we want to get to is our title and our self-determination. That's the subject matter that we need to achieve and articulate. And I remember I was called as an official witness at the opening, the establishment of the BC Treaty process over in Squamish, a long time ago now. And I remember very clearly the words of late Chief Joe Mathias, who was one of the main leaders on the First Nation side of getting that work going. And he said very clearly that the age of extinguishment is behind us. We are now moving into a different era and a different mode of relations. And the reason why the treaty process has not been successful, other than a couple of exceptions, is that the Crown showed up not in the way that we expected. They came with their old status quo approaches, their old models, very limited, and so it didn't go anywhere. Now, the failure of that process has now infected the idea of the word of treaty. It's almost like treaty is a bad word almost in some way. And but we have to understand that what treaties can be if they're done in the right way. I mean, Snuneymuxw, we've got the treaty from 1854, and we were open to talking about in the treaty process. We entered it in 92, 93. We helped to establish that process, but we disengaged and walked away after about 10 years, like turn of the century, because Canada and BC were saying this is not a process where you're going to have title recognized. It's not a process where the Douglas Treaty rights are going to be properly implemented and respected. That they have to be consumed by the. It was properly speaking. You read paragraph 20 of the Haida Nation decision. They say there that treaties serve to reconcile pre-existing Aboriginal sovereignty with assumed Crown sovereignty. It's a reconciliation of sovereignties. It's sovereigns sitting down and figuring out how they're going to live together, which was, by the way, a very weird thing for a Canadian court to be saying, because you do not talk about Aboriginal sovereignty in the Canadian court system. You'll get, run out of the room. It's not part of the discourse. And nonetheless, they said that for whatever reason. I don't know why, but they said it. And I think it's an accurate reflection of the kind of moment that we're in now, where we can't allow ourselves to be stuck in the mud of a process that was started 25 years ago that has not been productive. Too much has now happened. We now have a unique moment where, at least in BC, we have a federal and a provincial government saying that they're going to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they're going to implement the Chilcotin decision, and they're going to review all federal law and provincial law and policy to bring it into alignment with Canadian jurisprudence in Section 35 and the UN Declaration. That's a profoundly different approach. It's one where, instead of asking a nation to set all of their inherent rights aside and to take in place a stack of paper, and that all of your rights have to live within the four corners of that paper, set aside all of your Aboriginal title, and instead of that, take some fee simple blocks of land of a small scale. Instead of doing that, it's saying that something really different, that we're going to recognize the inherency, the legitimacy of Aboriginal people's claim to have a proper relationship with their territories and to be in control over their own destiny. And we're going to seek to coordinate the way that Indigenous peoples and the rest of the country live and work together and make decisions together. We're going to embrace this idea of cooperative federalism, that Aboriginal peoples have real scope and space through Section 35 to create something different. So that's the best version of the moment that we're in. It's a very challenging moment where we all have to rise to that challenge and do the hard work necessary to articulate that vision for the future, to be able to create that fundamentally different approach. Because up until now, the entire approach of the Crown has been one of total denial. Aboriginal title doesn't matter, Aboriginal peoples don't matter, we'll put the Indian Act in place. There is nothing inherently valuable about the Aboriginal reality. Let's set all of that aside. Your culture, your language, your spirituality, your religion, your relationship to your territory, even your relationship as a family member. When my mother was in residential school, she wasn't allowed to acknowledge that her brother at the residential school. She said, the way she described it, they had to steal sort of secret little waves and acknowledgements across the field from each other. That was the most of a human brother and sister relationship they were allowed. And so that's a pretty grim place to start from. We've got a very grim, horrible status quo that we're starting from. But, to express hope, we've got the makings of something fundamentally different. But the window is very narrow. Governments change. We have to grab a hold of this moment when we've got this current federal government and this current provincial government and make headway that we can't turn back from. And so it's urgent, important work of crafting that different kind of understanding and relationship you talked about, whether it's through a treaty mechanism or otherwise. So thank you.
I just thought I'd add one thing real quick. During my talk, I mentioned about our creation story of islands, and I mentioned specifically Thaltas, James Island. And so that island, when we signed the treaty was supposed to protect village sites and so forth. So this island, it had a village site on it, a burial ground on it. We entered the treaty. This island wasn't included. Just 2 years after the treaty, something like that, it was sold, and it's gone through a whole array of different things. It was a private hunting ground. There was a big dynamite factory built on it. It was bulldozed, contaminated. I brought in Jack Nicklaus to make a golf course. It's had everything under the sun happen to this island, and I just thought I'd bring that up just because just recently SAO decided to make a claim to say that that island should have been included in the treaty, and we would like the government to buy it and give it to us, back to us, as it rightfully should have been. So whether that'll take into account some of the laws that I spoke about is a different question, but just another way I thought I'd mention with the treaty and some of the things I spoke about. So.
Well, thank you all very much. Thanks to our panelists. I'm going to ask Jeremy Weber to come up now. He's going to introduce our concluding speaker, but before we let them go, let's please thank our panelists.